Hi, I'm back with the second part of the material section of my God tier landscapes tutorial series on YouTube. So this is going to be a direct follow-up to the last video, which if you haven't watched, you don't need to watch. You need to make sure you go and watch the first two videos in this playlist in order to get a landscape and to get the splat maps you need in order to follow this tutorial. But if you're an intermediate level or you've worked a little bit with landscape materials before, the last video really is just an introduction for beginners to how we might start to think about setting up a landscape material. And to be honest, the way that I set the material up in the previous video, that's pretty much the way that most of the materials that you can get on the marketplace have been set up. They just take it a lot further, make it a lot more complex, and you end up with this big sprawling network of nodes that seems completely impenetrable to newcomers. And we're not going to do any of that. We're going to create a material that's way more powerful, or equally as powerful as some of the best landscape water materials you can get on the marketplace, but you're going to understand it, and it's going to be set up in such a way that you can easily go in and modify and make huge sweeping changes in a matter of minutes. I hope to ram the point home by the end of this video that making landscape materials isn't as complex as you might imagine it to be, or nor is it as complex as it once was. And that's all thanks to the brand new material layers workflow that exists inside of Unreal. Previously, in the last video, if you followed along, it takes a really long time to go through and to set up all of the names of the parameters. And then if you want to make a change to the way that the material works, and you want that change to apply to every layer, let's say you want to add some macro variation, let's say you want to reduce the specular shine on the landscape, you have to go through and do that on every single layer individually. And that means creating a new parameter, that means naming the parameter, that means assigning the parameter to a group so that it's easy to find it when you're working inside the material instance. Wouldn't it be great if there was a way to just set up a single layer, to do that one time, and then to have that be a reusable function that you can reuse throughout your material instance without having to go and create the names for each layer individually? And wouldn't it be great if inside of the material instance, if you wanted a new layer, you don't have to go back to the master material and set it up inside of the node graph. You just hit a little plus icon to add a new layer to the stack, like in Photoshop, and it automatically creates the material for you and you can set up the blending however you want entirely inside of the material instance. Well, thankfully, that exists. It's material layers, and that's what we're going to dive into now. So let's begin. This is the material that we created last time. It already looks pretty good, and you could, reduce that tiling by blending in a few different layers, but it would take a lot of time to go and do that if you were using the traditional method. In previous versions of Unreal, dating back to, I think, 4.24 or 4.23, you had to go into the project settings and you had to search for something called material layers, and you had to enable the material layers. I can't remember if it was in the project settings or if it was in the editor preferences. I imagine project settings, but if you don't find it there, have a look in the preferences if you're in an older version of Unreal. And you had to go and you had to actually enable the material layers feature. So right now, in the editor preferences, you can find the example layers and blends switch here, which will just make that workflow a little bit more intuitive. And I believe that this will automatically be ticked and set up already. So as of 4.27 and possibly 2.6, there's no need to go and enable the layers and blends. They're already set up by default. So I'm going to click on the landscape and I'm going to navigate to where this landscape beginner is set up. And we're just going to create an entirely new master material. We're going to call this landscape God tier, because that's the silly name I gave this series on YouTube. And we're going to do the same thing that we began with last time, which is we're going to turn on use material attributes. So we get rid of the make material attributes there. And now we're going to search for a node called layers. And you can see that we find a node called material attribute layers. I'm going to name this landscape layers. And this is kind of a bizarre node. It doesn't really behave like any of the other nodes. And this is effectively what allows us to take full advantage of this new material paradigm. We don't really have to do much else inside of the master material itself. So you can see that with this selected, we've got this little layers drop down, and by default, we have no layers because we haven't created any layers. So we need to go ahead and set up a basic layer function that is going to be the basis of all of the layers that we use on this. So we're going to make it once, and then that's going to be the layer that we use everywhere. So I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm going to call this God tier landscapes. And I'm going to move that over to here. And now inside of here, I'm going to right click again, and this time I'm going to go and create a material layer. So this gets the same icon as a function, because it is in essence a function, but it's a function with a couple of special inputs and outputs. So I'm going to type ML for material layer. I'm going to call this landscape basic. So this is going to be a basic landscape material. And you'll see, I'm not going to close it because I want to open. And you're going to see with this open, we get the input material attributes and we get the output material attributes. So basically it can take in a material and it can pass out a material. And then we have this set material attributes, which currently doesn't have any attributes being set. So that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is we actually want to set up all of the layers that is going to comprise our basic material landscape. And they comprise a single landscape layer. So I'm going to click the set material attributes. I'm going to click plus here, probably 4 or 5 times, and that's going to bring up all of these layers. Now I know that we don't need to set the metallic, so we're going to ignore that. We're going to delete that one. We do want to set the specular. We do want to set the roughness. We do want to create a normal as well, and we possibly want to pass through an ambient occlusion. But tell you what, yeah. So for the time being, that's what we're going to do. We're just going to keep it to those 5 layers. And I'm going to create a texture parameter, an actual texture sample parameter, 2D. I'm going to call this one color with the English spelling. I'm going to create roughness. I'm going to create the normal. I'm going to create AO as well. Now, there are lots of things that we could do to optimize this material, such as packing our textures, but that's going to be the subject again of a future tutorial. So, and there's plenty of resources about that online, which I'll make available in the description too. So I'm just going to select all of these nodes, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did last time when the textures were not displaying correctly on the landscape. I'm going to preempt that issue occurring again, and I'm going to set the sampler source to shared wrap. Setting it to shared wrap increases the number of texture samplers that we're allowed to use inside of Unreal, inside of a single material, from I think it is 15 or 16 up to, it might be, I think it's over 100. I can't remember exactly how many, but it greatly increases the number of individual textures you're able to use in a single material like this. And I'm just going to hook the color into the base color. I'm going to hook the R output there of roughness. I'm going to hook in the normal ambient occlusion, again, just for the R channel. And then I'm just going to hold S and click to create a specular value. And by default, I'm going to leave that on 0.1. No, let's leave it on 0.5 since that's what it defaults to if you don't plug anything in. So we've created this. Now we need to make sure that the sampler types are set to the correct sampler type. So this normal currently is set to color. So I'm going to set the default normal to be base flattened normal. That changes the sampler type to normal. And then for the AO and the roughness, I'm going to change that to white square texture, since that is going to, for the roughness, make it fully rough, and for the AO mean no AO. So this is kind of our blank setup, in a sense, of a single landscape layer. I'm going to apply, I'm going to save, and we're going to go back to this landscape layers, the actual master material where we've put our landscape layers node. And then for the layer asset, you're now going to see we get this ML landscape basic that we created. I'm going to plug that in there. And that's, you can see the output has changed. So that's what it's displaying by default. It's displaying that basic layer that we set up in the function. So at this point, I'm going to create a material instance from the landscape material master material. So I'm going to create a material instance. I'm going to call that MI GT landscape. And I'm going to pull that over and plug it into the landscape material slot on the train. We're going to lose all of that lovely texturing that we set up before. Let me just get this. Okay, so that's not a problem. We're going to open up the material instance now, and you're going to see that in the details panel, which is where we were previously working with the old material to change all the parameters, we get nothing apart from a few default presets, including the m_landscape_godtier, which you can see here. So what we've got now, which is where we're actually going to work, is this layer parameters drop down up here. And you can see that we've got this background layer that we set up inside of the master material. It's called background. So this is the first layer that gets spawned, but we also get, if we open this up, access to all of those parameters that we defined inside of the material layer. And not only that, we can click this little plus icon here to create a new layer. We can sample that same material layer, And you can see that it's taking a little while to compile the shaders here as it gets everything set up under the hood. And then if we expand that drop down, we get access to those same texture parameter values and scalar parameter values that we defined in the material layer. But they're not going to override those for the background. These are, just to be clear, these are two entirely different layers. It doesn't matter that the parameters are named the same in here. And this is really powerful. This is how we go from having a really static, inflexible, and slow workflow when creating landscape materials to being able to iterate on the fly in seconds rather than minutes or possibly even hours. So, okay, we can go ahead. I'm going to name this layer grass here because it's useful to remain organized. And then I'm going to create another two layers too. I'm going to create the sediment layer, and I'm going to create the rock layer. And then inside of here, I'm just going to have to hook up each of those. And once they're all hooked up, you're going to see that the same parameters exist inside each of those layers. But this isn't all that the landscape material layers workflow asks of us. If you have a look under each layer, you're going to see that you have a layer asset. You also have a blend asset. And the blend asset is really important. It doesn't define the look of a single layer itself, but it's an asset which defines how that layer gets blended in. So if you remember, if we go back and have a quick little look at the previous material, we're using this node called blend material attributes, and then we're plugging in a layer sample, in this case, sample rock, into the blend material attributes there. And if we follow the chain back up, it's just going from the make material attributes. That's the A input of this blend material attributes. And wherever there's this sample grass, it blends in B, which is grass. And we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it inside of this new material creation paradigm. We need to create an asset called material layer blend. I'm going to call that MLB, and we're going to call this grass layer. I'm going to jump inside of this, double clicking it. And by default, it's already set up pretty much everything for us. We just need to input one thing. You can see it's handily named bottom layer, top layer, and output there. And we just need to define the alpha. So how are we going to define the alpha? You might have guessed it. We're going to just take a sample grass. In fact, I'll search in here and I'm going to type in landscape layer sample. There we go. Sample none. I'm going to change that to grass. And now I'm going to plug that into the alpha there. I'm going to hit apply, save. I'm going to go back into the material instance. I'm going to close the old material because it's just up there floating, and I'm going to get it out of my taskbar because it's taskbar. Is that the taskbar? Bookmarks, and it's just in the way. So now on this layer called grass, I'm going to go where it says none down here, and you can see we've got a bunch of layer blends by default, but we want to use the new material layer blend grass layer. So I'm going to plug that in there. Okay. So by default, we're not going to see any change, and that's because we haven't defined the layers to look different in any way at this point. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back. I could just plug in the textures, but before we do that, I'm just going to add a functionality to the material layer that I know all of the layers need to have, and that is the ability to tint the texture. So I'm going to hold M on the keyboard and click to put down a multiply, and V on the keyboard and click to put down a vector. I'm going to call this tint. By default, the tint is going to be white. That is no tint at all. I'm going to multiply that in there. And then I'm going to hit apply. I'm going to hit save. And if we go back to the material instance, and in the grass layer go down, we see there's a new vector parameters drop down with the tint parameter available there. And I'm going to make it red. So in theory, I should see that applying to the terrain. Now, why am I not seeing that applying to the terrain? Well, you could be justified in thinking that it's because we haven't assigned a blend layer to each of these layers above this, and they're higher than this layer in the stack. So perhaps not having a blend layer is equal to filling the terrain with that material. So it's not that, even though that is a logical conclusion to come to. So what happens if we go into the viewport again, and let's press Shift-2 to jump into the landscape editing mode. We're going to see that we've got these question marks next to each of the layers in the panel here. So what does the question mark mean? Does it mean that the layer no longer exists? Well, let's have a little look. Let's go and have a look in the visualizers and look at the layer debug and press R, G, and B. And we can see that all of the layer information is still there. So we've still got the layers. We didn't lose those somehow. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is the fact, due to a slight kind of peculiarity of how the material layer system is set up, if you don't reference the landscape layers inside of the master material, the top level of the material itself, then the landscape's not going to know that they exist, and it's going to give you these little question marks. So it's not going to know where to apply those layers. So how do we get around this? We've set up our layers samples inside of the blend assets themselves. Now, this is perfectly logical and intuitive. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. So we're going to have to do something that's a little bit less logical, a little bit less intuitive. Well, it's still logical, and I'll explain to you why it works, but it's not a conclusion that you might just arrive at quickly. So I've thought about this for a little bit. I was like, how are we going to actually get the data? We're going to set up the layers. So let's just do that first of all. Let's declare these layers inside of here. Now, okay, we've got them in our master material, the main layer, and we've also got them declared inside of each of the layer blends. And we somehow need to replace the reference to this. We need to somehow pipe it directly from the master material through the landscape layers so that it comes out and we can use it inside of the blend layer. So how do we do that? Okay, well, we're going to have to abuse a certain aspect of how the material set up. We're going to have to take advantage of customized UVs. So customized UVs are just like UV channels in essence. If you imagine you have a static mesh, you have the UV channel 0, which is where you store which correlates to your texture information. If you're using baked lighting, you might have another UV channel which you use for the light maps. But you can actually have up to, I think Unreal allows you to have 7 or 8 different UV channels, and each of those can contain custom data. So we abuse that in a lot of different ways. We abuse that to create wind. That's how SpeedTree handles its wind, as it stores custom data in the UVs. It's how you use Pivot Painter. Pivot Painter 1 stores information relating to the pivots in the UVs. But we can actually use these UVs to carry any sort of data. And you're going to see, if I just do a quick make material attributes, am I going to get any of those? No, we're not going to get them here. So what I've got to do is actually, I'm going to go as set material attributes. Now, remember, that's the same thing we did inside of the material layer itself, set material attributes. And the set material attributes is just like a make material attributes, except it allows you to be a little bit more selective about which ones you override. So it keeps things neater. That's all we're using this for. But it also allows us to add a few attribute types. I'm going to add 2. And I'm going to use the UV channel 1 and UV channel 2. Okay, so we've got these 2 node inputs, which by default won't do anything unless we make them do something. And what we're going to do is we're going to use those to carry this data, these layers that we've set up in the master material, the main material, and they're going to get channeled into the landscape layers. First of all, they're going to get channeled into the landscape basic, as that's the very first base layer. And that's going to get sampled here in this input material attributes. So this is a function input, which is going to take these material attributes that we pass through here. This then gets carried forwards, and we're setting the layer parameters, the specific layer parameters, base color, specular, roughness, normal, and ambient occlusion. But at this stage, we're not overwriting those customized UVs, which are getting channeled through. So they get preserved, and we take them through to the output material attributes. Now, after this output material attributes, we're going to jump inside of the material layer blend, and you're going to see we've got this input bottom layer and input top layer. So what these inputs carry over is they carry over this output material attributes that comes from the layer itself. So if we just go through that all once more, we start by setting up the customized UVs, which contain our layer data. So customized UVs are 2 channels each. So that means we can plug the grass and the rock into UV1, the sediment and another into UV2, and however many we want to add. Then we pass that into the landscape layers. Inside of the first landscape layer, that gets carried over. We set the material layer attributes, but preserve those UVs. They get passed as an output of that layer into the blend layer, where you can access them both from the bottom and the top. Now, if we were to do a get material attributes in here, you're going to be able to pull out whatever you want. You could pull out base color, metallic, and if you were to pull out the base color from the top and the bottom layer, they would be different. But because we're never overriding those customized UVs, we can pull out the customized UV from either of these layers, and it's going to be that same layer info that we set up in the master material. So let's go ahead and see if that works. First of all, I'm going to go back to the master material, and I'm just going to make another node called make float2. So this is making a two-dimensional vector, okay? Like texture coordinates, it's just 2 dimensions, but in this case, we're going to use it to pass through our layer weights. So I'm going to pass that there into the UV1, and I'm going to make another one for sediment and leave the Y empty for now. X and Y isn't really relevant to what we're doing, it's just the name of the channel. If you imagine we had a vector parameter, you have the R, G, and B, and essentially X, Y, and Z is the same as R, G, and B. It's just a different label. Okay, so we're passing these through here, and we need to make sure that these are actually going into our landscape layers. So after we have set up all of this inside of the master material, we're going to jump through. We don't need to do anything inside of the material layer, as that is only responsible for setting up the layer-specific parameters like texture information, but we are going to go into the material layer blend. What we're going to do is, for the material layer blend grass, first of all, we're just going to check which pin contains the grass. So it's simple sample grass goes into the first float value of customized UV1. Okay, so if we go back into the material layer blend grass, we've pulled out the customized UV1, and now we're going to use a node called break float2 components, and this is going to bring out the R and the G. So bizarrely, in here, when we make the float2, it refers to it as X and Y. When we come through here, it refers to it as R and G. These two channels are the same. R corresponds to X and G corresponds to Y. I don't know why that naming convention isn't consistent. Okay, so right now, where we're using this sample grass, instead, we're just going to pipe the X or the R out of the breakout float2 components into the alpha in place of that. And now what happens if we hit apply? Let's jump back out and jump out of the landscape mode, jump back inside. Now what I was expecting to see is I was expecting to see this grass layer info become populated. So why hasn't that happened? Let's see what we're missing out. I suspect that it's just a peculiarity of how the material layer systems work. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply and save the landscape master itself as well to be doubly sure. And there we go. There you have it. Now that we've saved the master material itself, we can see that we're no longer getting a question mark for each of those layers. Okay, but we're still not seeing anything on the terrain. So why is that? Well, let's just go back into the material layer blends and fill out both the rock layer and the sediment layer as well, in a similar manner to the way in which we've done the grass layer. So I'm going to copy this into the rock. I'm going to double check in the master material that rock is indeed in the second float value of the first UV channel. And then I'm going to make sure that I'm getting the material attributes from the top layer, although it doesn't matter whether I get it from the top or the bottom. And then I'm going to override the rock there too. And then we're going to copy this one more time into the sediment. And this time we don't want to get the UV channel 1, we want to get the customized UV2, and we're going to get the R, the first float value of the second UV channel. Okay, we're going to hit apply. We're going to hit apply. And then I'm just going to press Control, Shift, and S to save everything. Now we jump back in here. Let's go back into the material instance and quickly set up a blend layer for each of these. We're going to set up the sediment. We're going to set up the rock. And let's apply a different tint to each of these layers. And there you have it. We've now piped the layer information from the master layer. We've passed that through the custom UV channels into the landscape layers node. It gets passed through each layer where we set up the other parameters that define the layer itself, before finally being handed into the blend, where we then extract the corresponding layer information and use it to drive the blend. And although that takes a little bit of a setup, now that puts us in an amazing position. And the amazing position that we're in is that we have this new material instance setup where we can go in and define different textures and other various parameters relating to how we want the terrain to look. So let's quickly plug in all of the textures for each of those layers. And there you have it. We've set up each of those layers, and they have the textures applied. And And we need to do a little bit more work now because the tiling scale is clearly wrong. And we're going to take the terrain material just a little bit further. And this is where we're really going to see how this layered setup has been a massive boon for us in terms of the time it takes to iterate on the terrain. So in no particular order, the things that we're going to look at now, just in this latter half, so we're going to deal with how do we reduce this appearance of this tiling here. We're going to introduce some sort of macro variation color to each of the layers. We're going to get rid of this really glossy looking terrain because in real life, terrains don't look anything like that. They become very, very rough as they get further away and more towards grazing angles. So we're going to look at how we can combat that and make it look a little bit more physically correct. What else are we going to do? I think that will probably just about do us for this session. Maybe we can create a quick slope-based blend as well to add to sort of additively adjust each of those layers. So, okay, first of all, let's jump in and see what we can do about adding some more variation into each of those layers to reduce the appearance of tiling and to make it look a bit better from further away. So, okay. First of all, we need to add the ability for us to control the amount of tiling at each of those layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside of the material layer basic asset, and I'm going to create a landscape coordinates node. And we know that our landscape is 4033 by 4033. I'm going to apply a little multiply node. I'm going to hold M and then left click down to put down a multiply, hold S and click. I'm going to type in mapping scale there. By default, I'm going to set that to 1. And then we're going to take that output and we're going to plug it into each of these. Okay, great. So now we have the ability to control the amount of tiling, but that's only part of the picture when it comes to how do we reduce the appearance of tiling, because with this control, we're only going to be able to make it look from one certain distance. Anyway, let's apply that and set it to a scale that feels kind of right from, let's say, far away to begin with. Go back into the material instance, and let's change that mapping scale a little bit, shall we? We wait for each of these layers to compile. Okay, I'm going to set the mapping scale to, I'm going to go to a layer that I can actually see the difference on to begin with. There we go, 10. That's already starting to feel a lot better. So I'm going to do 10 for each of those layers to begin with. Okay, so I think that's looking reasonably good from far away. It's interesting. There's some variation. I haven't spent a lot of time picking the perfect textures or authoring the perfect textures, and that's definitely going to be the subject of some future tutorials. What I'm really interested in is just how can we create kind of like a convincing impression of a natural terrain in as little of time as possible. So now that we're in zoom this close, now I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer, and obviously it starts to fall apart at this distance. And I'm going to quickly go and place down a cube so that we have a good sense of, so we have a reference for the scale of a person. I'm going to set it to 1.8 meters. That's the Houdini axis for up there. Axis. I never know how to say that word. And I'm going to do 0.5 in each of the other channels, just to give us an idea of a person. And if we were to fly into the fly in and position ourselves inside of the cube at roughly head height, you can see this is what we get. And the terrain's looking all right from far away, although it's still a bit, much too specular. But then when we look at it up close, it's clearly falling apart. So, okay, that's going to be the next thing we deal with. How do we add in the detail texturing? Since in this case, I've done the macro textures first. How do we plug in some detail textures to ensure that it's looking good up close? Now, a popular way of doing this is to actually blend between the two using a lerp based over distance. And I'm not really a fan of this approach because it, I don't know what the correct phrase would be, but it breaks the coherency of the scene. How do I explain that a little bit better? If you actually replace the texture information based off of how close you are, then it's no longer in any way, you could no longer in any way argue that it's physically based. You're actively switching between the two textures, and when you're here and you're looking at the train from afar, it's going to look completely different to when you're looking in close down here. And if you were to fly the camera forwards and backwards between those two, and you would see those textures changing. Even you can make the blends look really subtle, but if you actually just switch the textures, it's going to be there for people who are looking for it. And what I'm more a fan of is a technique that I discovered from a blog about World of Tanks. and how they handle their landscape blending is I'm actually just going to modulate the colors by using another texture that I'm going to blend in to this. And we're going to create some controls that allow us to define how much we weight each of those layers. And it's not going to change over distance. We're going to find the values that work both close up and both far away. So let's go in and have a good look at setting that up. We're going to go inside of our material layer, and the first one that we're going to worry about, the one which, in my opinion, is the most important, is color. We're going to create that detail map for the color. So I'm going to call this detail color, and I'm going to create another multiply here. I'm going to call this detail mapping scale, and by default we're going to put that onto 10, so 10 times the default of the other. Now, you know what? I'm going to put the other default to 10 because that's what we've settled on in the material instance. And I'm going to set this one to 100. So this one is 10 times higher frequency detail than the other. I'm going to apply that into the UVs there. And now, if we were to apply this, we could just replace the material, but it's just that all that's going to do is completely overwrite it. So what we need to do is we need to come up with a way of blending. So how are we going to blend? Well, if you remember, I mentioned that World of Tanks blog. They outlined a really nice way to do blending between colors. Unreal does have its own detail texturing that you can use, but I'm going to show you how we can set up our own. So the way I'm going to do that is we've got our macro color here, and we've got our detail color here. Well, we're actually going to convert this to a texture object. So, okay, we're going to go, looks like I have to just make a new one from scratch. I'm going to create a texture object parameter. I'm going to call this detail color. I'm going to set the default to be the same as the non-detail default. Come on, why are you not letting me do that? So sometimes if you hit this little icon and then you try to apply it like that, it's not actually going to do anything. So what I need to do is I need to make sure that I've got the content browser visible, select that texture, and then apply it there. There we go. And then we're going to just turn this into a regular texture sample. Oh, that's a font sample. Texture sample. So this is no longer going to be a parameter. Okay, so if you remember, the difference between a sample and an object is that the sample is looking at the object and then it's converting it into a format that the material editor can use elsewhere to do further operations on. The texture object is simply a reference to disk, but is simply a reference to the file, but we do need to sample it at some point. So we're going to have to use a sample anyway. So we're going to create a single texture object reference, and we're going to create two texture samples, which both sample the same texture. Okay, so this is a little bit of a wasteful way of doing this, but it creates a nice result. And I think it's going to be worth exploring it. See what kind of look we can get. And then we're going to plug the same tiling factor into both of these UVs here. Okay, so we've got our detail texture, and then we're sampling it twice with the same tiling factor. Now what we're going to do is we're going to grab one of these, just one, and we're going to change the MIP value mode. I'm going to actually, there's one thing I need to remember to do, which is I need to set these all to shared wrap so we don't run into that texture limit restriction. But then we're going to select one of these samples, and we're going to make sure that the MIP value mode is MIP bias. So MIP bias, if you're familiar with how MIP maps work, is MIP maps, let's go to a texture and actually have a look at it. We can have a look at the different MIPs for this texture. We have our main texture that we've imported, which is a certain resolution. And the MIP maps are simply lower res, blurrier versions of the same texture. And we compute these for real-time graphics because it's more memory efficient to load up the smaller textures, and also because it reduces the appearance of aliasing on objects far away. And aliasing is an artifact you get when you have high frequency detail that is higher frequency than the number of pixels on the screen. So it starts to create a shimmering kind of effect. So that's why MIP maps exist, but we're going to take advantage of the fact that we have both a sharp version of a texture and a blurry version of a texture. We can sample both at the same time. So we've created a MIP bias, and you might realize, now that we've done that if we create a scalar parameter value and plug that into the bias here, we can actually control how blurry the texture is. So let's have a little look. Have a look at this one. Okay, so the tiling factor, but just for the sake of viewing this in the viewport, I'm going to disable the UVs for now. So you can see this is our sharp version of the texture. Now if I switch to the other one and plug back in the bias, and we start to ramp up this bias, you're going to see that we start to create a really blurry version of the same map. Okay, so let's plug back in the UVs. Okay, so what's the point in doing all of this? Well, The point in doing all of this is that we want to get the detail from this map, but we want to get the color from the global variation map. And if we add both of these maps together, then it's going to produce quite an ugly result. So I'm just going to show you what that would look like before we actually take advantage of this biased MIP version here. So for the time being, we're just going to see what that looks like. We're just going to add together the unMIP biased version, unMIP biased sample of the texture with the default texture. I'm going to see how that looks. So I'm looking at it in the editor viewport now, and I realized that I've still got the layer tinted above, the sediment layer tinted, which is kind of distracting me from looking at the result a little bit. And it's actually also very noisy normal. So I'm going to add in another control to the layer before proceeding to, which is I'm going to add in a control that allows us to control the normal intensity. And we're going to put in the node flatten normal. I'm going to call this parameter flatten normal. And by default, I'm just going to put this onto 1. Actually, no, I'm not going to put it in here on 1. I'm going to do that in the material instance. So by default, it's going to be off. What flatten normal does is it just weakens the contribution of the normals, and a value of 1 is completely off. So I'm going to do that for each of the layers, just so that we can see, while we're working, the influence purely of the base color and the AO and the other maps. But the normal is the one which is kind of getting in the way of being able to judge for ourselves how that's looking. So, okay, so we're adding those two together, and you can see that the result we get is just very bright, and mainly what we're getting actually is the higher frequency texture showing through without much of the other layer kind of contributing to the end result. So why is that? Well, the reason for that is because the brighter of the two textures is always going to be the one which is more visible. So what I'm going to do for the time being is I'm actually just going to apply the same texture at 2 different scales to each of those layers. And that's going to help a little bit. But and you see, if we go into the is this the grass? I think that is, I'm not sure what that is. That is the sediment. Okay, so if we go into the sediment, you can see we've got some sharper, more defined details in there, and we've also got these kind of big splodgier details for the larger terrain. But yeah, no, it's not particularly clear. It's over brightened the texture. We don't really want to make the textures brighter like this. We want the overall intensity to look the same, but we want to get those details anyway. So the way that we do that is before adding in the high frequency version of the texture, we subtract the blurred version of the same texture, like so. And there you go. You can see that although we're getting quite a lot of specular information, which is kind of washing out the scene, we've got the higher frequency details being very clearly displayed on the terrain. So I'm just going to get another little cube and chuck him down here. 1.8. Always. It's the bane of my life being using 2 softwares with different up axes. Okay, but if I zoom out now, you can see we're getting that nice macro scale variation that we had to begin with. But if we zoom in, we've also got some texturing information that is at a more appropriate scale for the user. Now I'm just going to tweak those mapping scales and the bias a little bit to try and hone in on the look of the landscape a little bit more closely. So I'm going to set the mapping scale of the detail texture to 1000. There we go. And I'm going to set that for each of those layers as well. So let's go up to the moss one here and put the detail mapping scale to 1000 for you as well. There it is. And then let's go up to let's ignore the rock for now because it's only over there on the horizon anyway, we can't see it. And what we can do is we can actually tweak the bias of this texture, of the blurriness. So the lower the bias, there you go. So if we make the bias really low, we're not going to actually get any of that detail in there. And the higher the bias we make, the more we make the bias high, like this, the more of the details from the underlying texture that we can blend in, the different kind of scales. So a value of 1 or 2 or 3, this is only going to pick out the smallest details. But as we make this higher, we can get some of that nice variation that we want. I'm thinking a value of 6 is looking quite nice for us there. But what I don't particularly like is that all of the all of the specular information and roughness and normal information is actually only happening on a macro scale. So I'm going to go ahead and inverse the mapping scales of those 2 terrains, and I'm going to flip around the texture coordinates so that These are all of the detailed textures, and this new one that we're introducing is actually the macro texture. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm actually just going to grab the mapping scale and flip them over, like so. And then I'm going to hit apply. Right. So now you can see we're getting the specular information on the smaller scale. We're still getting that macro color variation when we zoom out. Now, it doesn't look quite right. And the reason for that, it's actually partially because I haven't assigned the correct texture to one of the material layers. So let's have a look at what that's going on there. Looks to me like it's the background layer is showing up through some of these other layers. So I noticed as well that despite not having a weight applied to it, the background layer is still clearly showing up through all of the other layers. So the background layer if we go back to the material instance, you can see it's the one which doesn't actually have any material layer blend assigned to it. It's just the one which exists as a kind of foundation in the material. And it's the one which we assigned in the landscape, in the master landscape material as a background. The background needs to exist, but you don't get to control where it's applied. It's applied everywhere. So we want to go ahead and recreate the same kind of setup we had in our beginner landscape, where we just have a blank layer as our default layer. So, okay, how are we going to do that? It's quite simple. We're going to go to the folder where we created our other material layers, and we're going to create a new material layer. I'm going to call this ML None. If we jump inside ML None, have a little look, this is already doing everything that we need it to do, which is precisely nothing. Then we're going to go back to the parent material, the master material, and where we assigned that basic layer, we're actually going to assign that none layer. So by default, we get this black sphere. We now apply and save. Jump back into this viewport. That hasn't worked. So we need to go to the material instance and make sure that this indeed is also, so you see, even though we changed it in the master material, it hasn't actually updated the background layer used inside the instance yet. So I'm going to hit this little yellow icon to reset to default. Just going to set that to none. And we're going to have to wait a second while this compiles. And now you can see that we've lost that erroneous layer. So if we zoom out a little bit, you can see that we're not getting any massively noticeable tiling, which is great. And also, if we zoom in down to one of our little cubes here, you get a period where the texture, the macro texture appears a little bit blurry. But as we get closer, you can see that we have the nice high frequency detail that you want to see as a player. So that's great. Now, with this macro texture that's scaling across the entire map there, it looks good from far away, although, I mean, we're not really using the appropriate textures as mentioned before. So you could get a lot closer by having a more appropriate macro variation texture with less contrast, with less sharply defined features, and then you would no longer see these kinds of like weird blurry grass strands, which are clearly way larger than they should be as you zoom far away. And that's going to work a lot better. Okay, so we've got high frequency detail, we've got detail far away. Now we need to deal with this weird specularity, this super glossy terrain material. So what you could do is you could go into the layers and you could just go to that specular control, and let's go and turn that down. This is going to get you part way there. I'm going to go to each of those layers. It's going to get you part way there. But it's not really the whole picture. There's something else we need to do first. Before we jump back inside the material to do what I plan to do next, we're going to turn off the flattening of the normals so that we actually get some normal contribution back in our scene. There we go. And yeah, we've got our normal detail back, so the ground's going to look a lot better now. But what we need to do to get rid of the specularity is we need to go into the material layer and we need to compensate for the fact that the terrain, as you look at it at a grazing angle, is going to appear rougher and rougher and rougher and rougher. Do you imagine that we have a terrain that looks like this? It's just an abstraction. You might see some light that bounces off when you're standing here, or let's say here. When you stand here, you might see some light which bounces down at a grazing angle, let's say, or let's say here, and into your eye. And that's what we call a specular reflection. And you're going to get a few of those up close due to the reflections of sort of smooth objects in the ground glinting right back towards you. But as you get further and further away, the angle that it would be required for that to bounce into your eye gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And there's more and more detail to the point where where you might have a few glints up close and a nice reflection there, far away it's going to be basically the appearance of a fully rough matte material. So the way that we're going to do that kind of distance-based influencing of the specularity is we're going to use, or angle-based in essence, we're going to use a node called Fresnel. And we just preview that Fresnel node, you can see that it's finding the angle of the object we're looking at, and then it gives us a black to white kind of ramp. Black being, well, I say black, it's light gray. If I change the exponent into 0, that's going to become no, base reflect faction, sorry. If I change the base reflect faction in there, then we're going to see that it's a value of 0 on those angles which are more perpendicular to the viewer. And then those which are at grazing angles are going to be 1. So we're going to take alert out of this, and we're going to plug the output of the Fresnel into the alpha. And then we're going to make the B input, we're going to take the A input, and that's going to take our specular value. So that is the values closer to black, like so. And then we're going to set the B input to 0. So that's going to take the Fresnel down to, the specularity down to 0. And we're going to plug that into the specular. Now, you can see that this appears mostly white. There isn't actually a huge amount of difference between when we look at the raw specular value of 0.5 and the lerp that's lerping between 0 and 0.5. So we can change the influence of this Fresnel by then creating another scalar parameter, and we're going to call this, let's call this Fresnel specular exponent. Let's call it that. It's not really a correct name, but we'll go for that anyway. We can see that the default, it doesn't actually tell us what the default of the exponent is. So by default, we're going to leave that on 0. No, we're not. We're going to take it up to 0.5. 1, 2, 5. Okay, so the higher it gets, the more the white contributes. So we're going to go for a lower value. And there you go. I think I'm quite happy with setting that to a default value of 0.1, default value for the specular of 0.5. I'm going to stop previewing there. And now we're going to hit apply and see what happens to our terrain. Okay, that's more like it. It's still not perfect. We're getting quite a bright specular reflection, and the specularity is actually still a little bit higher than I would like it to be. So I'm going to go into each of those layers now. Let's go into the material instance. I'm going to minimize that viewport because it's not really very useful. I just want to see inside of the game viewport itself. And we've got the specular exponent. So let's see what we can do for each of these layers. So 2.1. I have a feeling that our none layer might be contributing a little bit here because the default value for specular is 0.5. So just to be sure that's not the problem, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to set the specularity of that layer to 0. I'm going to see if that fixes the issue. Okay, so there we go. That's dealt with that issue there, and you can see we've now got a much more matte result, which I'm a lot happier with. I'm going to raise the light angle there, 2. Okay, cool. So that's starting to look a little bit better. You're going to notice that because of the high frequency and sort of not appropriate textures we're using, that the terrain looks a little bit weird when you're in this kind of middle distance. But as mentioned before, that can be helped by using a better selection of macro textures. But you can see when we zoom out a little bit further, this is starting to look, pretty good. At least I think so. And if we zoom in close as well, it's starting to look reasonably good up close, just a bit too contrasty in that kind of middle distance region. Okay, so what next? Well, I think I'm probably going to be pretty close to leaving it there for today, as this is kind of a great foundational material now that you could take a bit further, apply some better textures to, and then start thinking about things like scattering grass as well. So yeah, I really think that at this point the material itself is a really solid foundation, and the next stage to start making it look a lot better would be really to start picking a few different better textures. And once we've done that, we could come back to the material and refine it even further. So the last thing that I will do before kind of clocking off is I'm going to introduce a little bit of automated slope-based blending into this terrain material as well. So if you remember all the way back in lesson 2, I mentioned that we didn't need to create a layer mask based off of the slope inside of Houdini because the capacity to do that inside of Unreal already exists, and it's very easy to do. So the final thing we're going to do is we're going to go to where we've created our material layer blends, And we're going to create a new material layer blend. I'm going to call this one MLB Slope. I'm going to open up that material layer blend, and for the alpha for this one, we're very simply going to create a slope mask. I'm going to set the fall off power, set the contrast, and by default, if I set the fall off power to 1, set the contrast to 0, you can see it's going to pick out the topmost, and we actually don't want to pick out the top. We want to pick out just the side regions. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a 1 minus on that result that we get there, and then as we increase the fall off power, decrease the fall off power, as we decrease the fall off power and increase the contrast, let's go to 0.2, 0.3. This allows us to sort of pick up the slope angles that we want this layer to texture. And since we've made these parameters, we can just modify those in the instance at the end of the day. So I'm going to assign that in there to the blend material attributes. We're going to jump into our material instance. There it is. And we're going to add a whole entire new layer. I'm going to call this slopes. We're going to set this to the material landscape basic, same as the other layers. And we're going to set this to be that new MLB slope that we created. I'm going to hit save once we've done that. I'm going to wait for it all to update. There we go. So that's now applying everywhere. But if we go into the blend, that's not applying anywhere at the moment. But if we go into the scalar parameter here, and let's start playing around with these values. And okay, all right, now let's actually define the layer itself. Let's go to where our textures are stored. And let's get that same Icelandic cliff texture that we were using previously. Apply the color textures, apply the normals, apply the roughness, the AO. There we go. And that's it for today. I hope that you've seen how easy it is. You could add as many of those different slope blended layers. You could add directional blended layers just by changing the angle of that slope. You know what? Let's just go ahead and do that as well, just to prove how easy it is. We're going to go into the material blend layer, and we're going to change the angle. So what's the default angle? It's 001. So we want to keep that at 001. Plug that in there, and I'm going to hit apply. We've updated the slope functionality to now have additional controls for us. I'm going to delete I'm just not going to delete them, sorry. I'm just going to close these other tabs so that I can see what I'm doing a little bit more easily. Close the slope as well, because we've done all we need to do in there. And now with just the material instance open, we're going to add a layer called snow, because why not? Every landscape looks better with snow. So we're going to create an ML landscape basic. We're going to create a new slope blend, and we're going to change the angle this time. So I'm going to make sure that it's visible by default. So I'm going to make it have a bit more influence. Still compiling shaders. There we go. So now this is it's currently applying everywhere, basically everywhere. But I'm going to change the angle so that it's no longer oh, why is that not? There we go. So, okay, that was weird. You have to minimize and re-maximize to make sure that actually takes effect, that checkbox. So right now, blue is up in Unreal, as that's the Z-axis. So we don't want it to be up. We want it to just be sideways in one direction. Maybe the other direction. Okay, not working. Oh, maybe that's because the fall off power is too great. So let's just change that. There we go. 0.1, 0.5. And we're starting to get some sort of nice directional effects happening on the terrain there. Assign a specific texture to that there. So have I got anything appropriate? Let's go with the rocky soil rather than snow. We'll call this like a dirt. Maybe the sandstorm recently came through here. I think I'm going to position this layer beneath the slopes. So I can just do that and just drag it down there. And that, after I save, now means that this rocky layer is always going to show up on top of those. So that new dirt layer we added, or snow, if you wanted it to be snow, is now going to show up. It's going to be overwritten by those steep slopes. And that's probably it for today. Just let's. Cool. Let's go with that. All right, we're done. Finally. All right. So thank you so much for your time, for watching this video, and I hope that you found it useful. I hope that you can see how powerful this material layers kind of paradigm working with landscapes is. It will make your workflow a lot faster, I promise. If you're not familiar with working this way yet, I would highly recommend adopting it. And yeah, so that's it for today. So next time, we might be looking into, I'm not gonna make any promises because I haven't made my mind up yet, but we might look into how you can actually make textures or mix different textures to create some slightly more appropriate large scale macro textures for terrains. Or we might look at the scope, we might look at having expanding making like a background. So like if you imagine this is your playable environment, might look at how you can extend that off infinitely, or not infinitely, but extending off the horizon so that it looks like you kind of have that you're actually situated in the real world, and it's it doesn't just end, and you don't have to use too many fake tricks. So we'll be going back a little bit to using real world height map data, using lower res data, extending it further away, and blending that into this high resolution data that we have for the playable area. Thanks again for watching. If you find this kind of content useful, then please like and subscribe. Please share the content around. I'd love to be able to make more of it. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it, and I hope to. I'm loving all the comments. Thanks so much to those of you who've already liked and subscribed, and I'll catch you next time.